Greetings, everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We have a number of people still joining, so I'm just going to hold off for about 2 minutes. So for those of you who made it right on time, thank you for doing so. If you can hang in there for another 120 seconds or so, we'll get started. Alrighty, let's get started today. Hopefully everybody can see a combination of some graphics and slideware that sits as sort of the primary on your screen surface, and then our two little heads over on the right-hand side. My name is Dave Gruber. I am a principal analyst with the Enterprise Strategy Group. Today we're going to be talking about cybersecurity strategies for effective attack surface reduction. Attack surface reduction is a super important topic in the security industry, and one that touches on a number of different topics. And today we're going to explore that a bit here. Joining me today is Chandra from SecPod. He's the founder and CEO, very innovative guy, and we're going to be hearing a lot from Chandra throughout the conversation. As an industry analyst, I cover a number of key areas in the cybersecurity space. And I'll be sharing a series of data points from research that I do. One of the things as an industry analyst you get to do is you get to go out and research topics in the industry and talk to a tremendous amount of security leaders, security practitioners, and security vendors. And so I'll bring that perspective to bear as part of this conversation, and with lots of color commentary from Chandra along the way. Our agenda today is going to start out by just talking about the attack surface in general. Hopefully this is a term that's familiar to everybody, but we'll just touch upon some of the characteristics of what makes up your attack surface for just a little bit as a starting point. Then we're going to get right into security strategies for attack surface reduction. We'll be talking about asset visibility, the importance of it and what that means. We'll be talking about the role of automation when it comes to, once we understand our assets, reducing vulnerabilities and the whole vulnerability management process. And at the tail end, we'll talk a little bit about the SecPod solution. So you have some insights into the power of SecPod and what it can bring as far as reducing your attack surface. So with that, let's jump right in. When we think about attacks on the cyber front, there's sort of 10 common attack vectors we think about. Starting off on the bottom left here, software vulnerabilities is an attack vector that we talk a lot about. We put a lot of attention into along the way, but it's one of many on the attack surface, including other things like compromised credentials, of course, credential theft being a huge issue, and lots of things that we do to reduce that as well. Including identity issues around password, insider threats around malicious employees as well. So sorting out whether it's identity theft or insider. Encryption techniques and gaining access directly to data. Of course, ransomware has been a super hot topic and continues to be. I, in fact, did a very detailed research project earlier this year, which produced some super compelling insights on the state of ransomware readiness in the industry as well. So continuing important topic. Phishing, the phishing tactics are used in so many different types of attacks these days that touch upon many of the others here. Misconfigured devices. Oftentimes we think about configuration as a topic in itself, but in fact, when devices are misconfigured, they become vulnerable. And so as we're going to talk about today, we have a bit of an expanded definition of what we think about when we think about vulnerable systems and all the things that create vulnerabilities in the environment. Trust relationships, DDoS attacks, and of course, there's many more types of attack vectors along the way as well. What we want to do today, though, is sort of frame this up in the context of a broader perspective around the overall attack surface. So we think about attack vectors, we sum that all up, and your attack surface is effectively the sum of all of your exposed IT assets across all attack vectors. And attack vectors won't be precisely the same from one organization to another. You may have some attack vectors in your organization that are different than another organization would. A couple examples here. For instance, if you're a manufacturer and you use a lot of IoT type equipment and network connected devices in the OT world, that's a whole set of attack vectors that if you're not in using OT type resources and things, that's a attack vector that you wouldn't be focusing on. So just a quick example of a difference from one organization to another. When we think about protecting your organization, it starts with the fundamentals about what is my attack surface. And if you have built out a security strategy in your organization, then you've applied a series of controls, both proactive and reactive controls that effectively create a security infrastructure across each part of that attack surface. If we break it down here sort of in the major topics within the attack surface, oftentimes we become very focused on the network and network insecurities, and this tremendous amount of investment in network monitoring and looking for detection of things that occur at the network level. Of course, in the modern world where we're very dependent on SaaS-based applications, we have much less control of that environment through the network. Still important, of course, as part of our security strategy, but plays a different kind of role. We think about software bugs, that's traditional sort of software vulnerabilities, but as I mentioned, we're going to expand that topic pretty significantly as well. Physical security, of course, is part of the equation, and then the attacks that involve people, so sort of social attacks as well becomes a big piece of the attack vector along the way. So attack surfaces for most companies are growing very significantly. I'm sure you've been experiencing that as well. And by growth, in some cases, it's because your organization is growing, but in many cases, it's because the way you're automating your organization is changing and growing, and you're utilizing more SaaS delivered services. You're working more closely together with business partners through technology, through collaboration mechanisms along the way. You're sharing critical and core applications with extended parts of your business, whether that be third-party contract resources or business process outsourcers or other types of third parties who are involved in your environment. The net result of this sort of changing operational business models is that the attack surface changes along with it. So when I say attack surfaces are growing, I mean, not only maybe I have more people, more devices, more systems, but I also have different devices, different systems. I have more diversity in my environment. And as you can see from my research here, 2/3 of organizations said that their attack surfaces are growing along the way. When we look at sort of company size, and you may be from a very small company or you may be from a large company, but you note here that larger growth perspective typically occurs as your company gets bigger. Not that the problem is not just as challenging and important if you're a smaller company. So here we see 12% growth over the last 2 years for 1,000 assets or less, but then those organizations managing 10,000 or more assets actually have seen substantially more growth. So you can imagine how big those numbers turn into as well. So some more details about why this is happening. I mentioned the connections with third parties. That sits right at the top of the list. I mentioned user device diversity. I don't know about you, but I use many devices now every day in my world. And I also connect to many different applications inside the context of my organization, but also outside, third-party SaaS applications as well. The remote worker population, of course, has made a big difference. And so many of us are depending on personal devices, so devices not owned by our employer along the way. So it's super important that we were able to extend and have visibility there as well. And you see here, many organizations are increasing their use of IoT and OT devices and others. Hey, Chandra, I'm going to bring you in just here to chat just a little bit about device diversity. So this is as a solution provider, as a security solution provider, you have a big challenge to be able to keep up with all the device diversity that's happening, workload diversity, everything that goes with it. And so how do you do that? How as a technology provider, are you able to think about or architect solutions that are capable of supporting such a diverse attack surface?
Right. Hello, everyone. Hey, Dave. Yes, so I think that is definitely one of the challenges that every vendors have to deal with, because you have different kinds of systems, whether it's endpoint devices or bring your own devices type. So any devices connecting over the network and doing all sorts of operations. And beyond that, you have different kinds of services that are being run in the cloud infrastructure. So there's a variety of them, and then you'll have these OT and IoT type of an environment, as you mentioned earlier. So the IT landscape is growing, and that is a reality. And as a vendor, that is something that we must keep in account that while we are architecting a solution. So it is tomorrow, it is going to be something else beyond what we see today as far as the IT landscape is concerned, and you will have to be ready to support that and ready to accommodate that in your system architecture.
Yeah, that's so important for me, that security solution providers take this burden on versus individual security teams having to come up with different mechanisms and different strategies for each different device type and device category. For many of you who've been in this business for so many years, when we came up with our security strategy and we architected our security stack, what do we have to do? We had to go out and we had to look at each individual device type, each individual workload type, each individual environment, and then bring in yet separate tools which produce separate alerts, separate data, silos of information. And it was, it was basically find the special security control that went along with every single device type. There are so many device types in play now, device and workloads and SaaS apps and everything in play. It's not practical for any of us to be able to keep up with that challenge anymore. And so fortunately for us all, we can now look to solution providers like SecPod to take some of that burden away from us and help us converge that many mechanisms and tools and products, and hopefully do so through a more common architecture, common set of capabilities, so that when we do continue to add, because we're going to continue to grow the infrastructure, that you'll be able to take that burden off from us, and we'll be able to scale up our environment. So super important role that you're all playing. Chandra, I'm sure people don't thank you for that every day, but I'll thank you for it.
Thank you. So device-specific security doesn't work. It doesn't scale up. So you need to have security controls that kind of work across all sorts of devices, and you need to unify that and standardize that and present that view to the organization, because we can't say tell organizations not to use those, because those are essential and key elements for their businesses to function.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we're all challenged with getting from where we are today to, this more integrated or consolidated model too, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Hey, when I think about threats, this is my own diagram here. So if anybody looks at it and says, that looks funny, that's let me describe why I'm using this diagram. So when I think about protecting this attack surface that we're talking about here, there's many layers to our security strategy, and this is not necessarily representing a defense in depth strategy as much as it is a way to think about, we have an opportunity to reduce the risk profile for our organization by implementing multiple mechanisms or multiple controls in place that effectively reduce both risk and reduce the threats that we have to focus on over time. And this is while it's shown as a linear process, sort of things go in the top of the funnel, come out the bottom, we know that these mechanisms run in parallel, and this is really a parallel strategy, but for simplification purposes, I drew it sort of in this serial fashion here. But basically, the idea here is that the more we can do to reduce the attack surface, so to reduce the fundamentals of what's exposed externally, what's exposed from vulnerabilities, what's exposed from access control or privilege related challenges, all of those things, if we do a better job proactively, we are effectively preventing or stopping threats from being able to enter our environment, which then means our active security controls have less work to do because we've shut the front door. We've closed the doors and the windows up front, and our active security controls then have to do less work along the way. And that involves less people. So the better job we can do up front by reducing the attack surface, the less human resources we have to apply, the less active security controls we have to depend upon. And then very importantly, sort of in the next phase, where we know that there are certain threats that get through the prevention part of the stack. So those that do are often heavily reliant on human analysis, human investigation, human detection and response. And while there's been lots of investment over the last couple of years, or many years per se, between EDR and XDR and all the other detection and response technologies, there's still more manual and more human involvement required in that slice of the equation. So we want to do as much work up front in the preventative category as we can, so that we effectively shrink the funnel. That's my poor graphics here about trying to show the shape of the funnel getting less. So less threats end up in the detection and response category. And the net result of that is, my little stick figures on the right-hand side, is that less people are involved in the equation too. And hopefully that produces a more cost-effective security strategy or security model. Now, we see different organizations with different investment strategies here. Some people today are putting all kinds of time and money into detection and response. And I'm a big believer that detection and response plays a very key role in security strategy. But I also know that this funnel model is real, and the better job I can do up front in reducing my attack surface, the better job I do with my active security controls, the less human investment and the less potential risk I have, which ultimately puts me in the recovery category on the bottom of the funnel, where some attack becomes fully successful, carries out its objectives, and now we're in a full-blown recovery situation. Either we're recovering from backups, recovering business operations, recovering ransomware, great example right there. That puts us in that state when we have successful ransomware attacks. So I'll pause just for a second. Chandra, does this make sense just at its most basic level? Does this resonate with you?
Yeah, I think we kind of work with this belief in totality. I mean, prevention, investing in prevention, obviously less firefighting to do at the detection and response. So if you have applied the prevention controls early on, if you analyzed the entire IT landscape, understood all the weaknesses and vulnerabilities that are there, and prevented all of those weaknesses, so they're less likely that the organizations are going to be attacked. So it definitely makes sense to invest there, and all our solution is built with this belief in doing prevention first.
Great. So, and not to minimize the complexity of this prevention layer, because while I just listed in a simple term of attack surface reduction, there's lots going on. Thus, my earlier example of sort of the multiple different threat vectors that we're talking about here. So, so we want to zero in on those activities that can make the most substantial impact on attack surface reduction. And of course, on the active security controls front, we know that people continue to invest in many active security controls across the environment too here. So I don't mean to oversimplify in the diagram here. Okay, when we think about types of vulnerabilities, for me, for a long time, I thought about software vulnerabilities. And I thought about vulnerabilities in a fairly simple way for a lot of years in my career. And I thought about, well, as long as we patch software that has known or discovered vulnerabilities, whether they've been exploited or not, then we're going to be keeping up with this side of the landscape. Chandra, you have a different view of what a vulnerable system is, and it made so much sense to me when you first described it to me. I thought, well, of course, all of those things make systems vulnerable. But take our audience through your perspective on what it means to have a vulnerable system.
Yeah, so typically, I mean, there's some sort of a misunderstanding with what is vulnerability. Yeah, as you rightly mentioned, most people think that vulnerability is the software vulnerability as some sort of a bug that is present in the applications and the other type of software that we use. That is true, but there are other category of vulnerabilities. Well, when you ask for what is a vulnerability, it is some sort of weakness that is there in the IT infrastructure, in the computing environment. So there can be misconfigurations present. I mean, you have number of software applications that are deployed and maybe they are not hardened enough. Maybe they are running in some default settings, and that opens up the door for attackers to enter through that channel. But beyond that, you have other kinds of vulnerabilities. You also talked about security controls that are there already implemented, but are they configured properly? Are they working properly? Are there some sort of control that you had implemented and some changes occurred in that, and you don't have visibility into it? So those are also vulnerabilities. And beyond that, all sorts of assets that are exposed to the internet, what is running on them? Are they required to be running? Are there some outdated software and applications installed in a particular system? So all of these are potential loopholes that an attacker could exploit, and they're as equally important as software vulnerability. And if you look at any of the attacks that are taking place, it's not just the software vulnerability, it's not just the unpatched software applications, but other loopholes are also being exploited, including the human weakness. So any of the recent attacks, if you analyze, we will end up discovering that there are many kind of loopholes that we need to pay attention to, as equally important as the software vulnerabilities that we are familiar with dealing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even in my industry analyst firm, among the different cybersecurity analysts who cover the individual areas, we have people that specifically cover, endpoint and email, other people that cover network, other people that cover cloud, and specifically the application flow within the context of cloud and other areas. And one of the things that we struggle with sometimes is that vulnerability is more of a horizontal problem. It affects every one of our coverage areas. And sometimes we struggle with, from a security strategy standpoint, is it viable to think about or to consider a single solution that is that horizontal, that can cover off all of these topics and all of these areas? Because that just hasn't been the case in the past. And this is maybe it's more of a journey you're on to cover off as many of these areas of vulnerabilities as possible. But there are some common elements to how we think about the process, regardless to all the different functions and possible areas of weakness that would ultimately be described as a vulnerability in the environment. When we think about going through that process, there's still sort of this notion of what are those weaknesses? Where are those vulnerabilities? Are they risky? Are they not risky? Which ones become more important? Do we patch? And patch is like maybe a loaded term because there's lots of things that fit in the patch category. It's more like, do we remediate, right? And then how do we keep up with what our current risk profile is there through at any given time? What is our total risk situation across the environment? Take me through how you think about this process, because this is part of what gets built into the mechanism, the automated mechanisms. And then how do you think about how much automation, or where you're focusing your R&D efforts, your engineering work, as it relates to this sort of, and this is I know this is super generalized. I'm sorry if I've overgeneralized it here. I know there's lots more going on here, but my point was that despite the complexity of the vulnerability landscape, in the end, we need to go through a common process. Am I right there?
Yes, certainly. I think you touched upon some right points there. And you also mentioned that early on, there are endpoints and there are network devices, and each of you are covering different aspects. And when you look at it, vulnerability is kind of a common thread. I think it definitely makes sense to take the journey of unifying and presenting with a view that your entire IT landscape is having. I mean, all the vulnerabilities that your IT landscape is subjected to, or having those weaknesses. Only then I think we will be able to visualize and take actions, remedial actions, to mitigate those vulnerabilities or loopholes before an attacker could exploit them. And so the slide that you're showing, this is, if I had asked what is vulnerability management maybe 15 years ago or 20 years ago, people would just describe the way you're describing now. It's perfect wheel. So you identify the devices and identify the vulnerabilities, perform a risk assessment, prioritize the risks, remediate it, and then report it and make it into a continuous process. That has been the way it was described. But the problem is each of them operated in silo, and we didn't cover the breadth that we are supposed to cover as far as the IT landscape and the growing landscape is concerned. So we are not looking at the entire IT landscape and all kinds of vulnerabilities that I talked about. So that was one problem. And then each of these were operating in silos. So, for example, remediation was never part of a vulnerability management solutions. And it had to be kind of manual intervention between one system to another system. And so because of that, automation was never possible. And these are the problems I think we need to take head on and solve those problems. One is, do you cover the entire IT landscape? Do you uncover all sorts of vulnerability, not just the software vulnerability? And do you have an integrated mechanism of taking remedial actions to eliminate these vulnerabilities? And can we make it into a continuous and automated process?
So these are some of the things that, you've said to me before, Dave, at SecPod, we are innovating in this space, in a space that hasn't had a lot of innovation for a long time. And the topics that you're speaking of right now are, in fact, where you're investing, where you're thinking about things differently. So rather than simply following this relatively simple process that I've laid out here, you're thinking about, how do I leverage better analytics, more automation in the process, a more holistic view of this process, and integrate that. And that's really a very different approach to how vulnerability management's been done for a long time, right?
Yes. Yeah, that is certainly the journey that we have taken, and we have made significant progress in that direction. So we are thinking differently as far as vulnerability management is concerned, and it is essential that we give respect to the word management, because it's not just knowing the problem. You need to solve the problem. You need to solve it before an attacker could exploit those places that are there.
I love that you just said that. So because we lump too many things into this. Well, whatever the management that we can do at the time is, it gets lumped into the management category. And so if that's what vulnerability management used to be, then that's what it is. What you're saying is you're redefining what vulnerability management is. Maybe we need a new term, Chandra. Maybe we should come up with something new here, right?
Yeah, I think there are some terms that are making rounds in the industry. So attack surface management, for example, is also going through definitions, various definitions, and people are trying to understand what is attack surface management. Until recently, people thought attack surface management is just the external assets and uncovering those problems. So I think all of these are kind of taking that journey to redefine what they truly are. I'm sure we will all, as an industry, settle to some terminologies that we can all agree upon.
Great. Well, suffice to say, it's different than this. All right. So interestingly, in our research, we find that for the most part, people feel like, okay, we're doing an okay job in our vulnerability management process, which is, it doesn't line up with the results that are happening, the amount of times people are being attacked, where you read the data breach reports and you see that software and configure vulnerabilities are a massive entry point for successful attacks. Yet, when we ask, at least a third, more than a third, 35% said that they have a complete understanding of their asset inventory. They can analyze and prioritize and remediate in acceptable timeframes. And they're feeling pretty darn good. I think, those people, if you gave them an ABC rating, those people are saying like, yep, I'm doing a great job. I get an A. And then 46% said, well, I'm like doing a pretty solid job. There might be room for improvement, but it's pretty solid. I mean, that's like a B plus in my world. And that's like way over optimistic, right? That's over 80% of organizations are feeling generally pretty good. I mean, despite 65% said there's work to be done. For me, it leans way too far on the left-hand side of it. And I think part of that is this redefinition about, well, in terms of the way we thought about this simple process, we're executing on this. We have people in place that have a job that do this every day, and they're getting through the backlog of what they have to work with. Therefore, we must be doing a good job. Yet, there's a ton of challenges, right? That the same sets of people tell us they're struggling to keep up with the volume of vulnerabilities, and go figure, given the amount of new assets and device types and things that we're working with, the more of those there are, the more cloud workloads that people are working with, SaaS application use, there's just that many more sources of vulnerable infrastructure. Automate things that you already spoke of, automating the process of vulnerability discovery, prioritization process, like who owns it, who's going to mitigate it. That process is difficult as well. Many people are, in fact, still using different tools for different parts of the function. And so whether it's a different device type, they're using individuals or separate tools, or whether it's actually a break in the process flow where I'm using one tool to identify, another tool to prioritize and remediate, another tool to patch. So even in that case, where there's a loose connection between many of the automated tools that are taking, and then just the sheer volume of vulnerabilities means the analysis process, which is human assisted in most cases, to determine what to focus on, what to prioritize, is also a very intense part of the process. So there's a ton of challenges that are associated with this larger function. So I hope that you, in all of your innovation and genius, you can help people solve some of these along the way. And just notably, I mentioned a ransomware research project that I did earlier this year, and I was honestly surprised about this. When I think about ransomware, I thought for sure, the top entry point for ransomware was going to be somebody got phished in the human assisted piece, and it came in through email somehow, and someone duped the human element, but it's not. Like the number one entry point for successful ransomware attacks, which by the way was a very significant number of organizations have experienced successful ransomware attacks and had full-blown outages and paid the ransoms, were application software vulnerabilities and system software vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. So like this is a huge area of focus, despite the fact that people said, I rank myself as an A or a B plus in my program. I'm doing really great. Yeah, that's awesome. Explain that to the board when you get hit with a ransomware attack along the way. So it feels like to me there's a mismatch here of meeting expectations versus the actual results of what's happening here. I think that's a duplicate slide. So I'm going to ask you to do this now. So because you spend your life every single day, Chandra, focused on this problem set, take us through the SecPod perspective and how your solutions today are bringing innovation into this equation, or helping people solve these types of problems along the way. And please do that in the context of what's possible today versus your vision, the broader agenda, because you have I know this because you shared it with me, you have a huge vision about what's possible here, and I know you're on that journey. So take us through that journey.
All right. Yeah, so as you rightly highlighted, some of those challenges that are there as part of the vulnerability management task or a goal that I have within me as a security administrator of an organization. It is all of those that you talked about. Do we have understanding of all the vulnerabilities? There are huge number of vulnerabilities that I have to deal with, and the disintegrated remediation that came up there. And you also rightly pointed out, if you ask people, how are you doing today? And most of us will certainly say that you're doing great, right? So that is typically the response that you get to hear. But at the same time, when you actually analyze, even in our experience, when we talk to potential customers, we ask people to try out our software, and invariably, one thing that kind of stands out is that there are huge number of vulnerabilities that are kind of left open, and where people think that I have an A there. When I'm taking care of all the vulnerabilities I'm patching, but something is going wrong there. So people are not having visibility to all the problems that are there in the enterprise computing environment. So there are three questions that we are asking from SecPod. One is, are we uncovering the entire risks that the IT landscape, or loopholes that the IT landscape is having? And so that is question number one. The next thing is that, are we having remediation controls that I can go ahead and apply once I know the problem? Because knowing the problem is half done, and most people, early on, people just did a vulnerability scanning just to discover the problems, and they never acted upon. But that is not something that is useful anymore, because knowing the problem is not sufficient. You need to act upon it. And in order to act upon the problem, it is not just the software patches, it's hundreds of remedial actions that you must deploy in order to eliminate those vulnerabilities. The third is, how do you make it into a continuous and automated process? And people just ran vulnerability scan once a quarter and discovered the problem, and took another 6 months to mitigate those problems. So that is obviously not sufficient at this point in time. So you need it you need this process to be a continuous and automated daily sort of a routine where it is discovering the problem and you're able to roll out those remedial controls day on day and making it into an automated process. So these are the three questions that we are asking as part of SecPod, and obviously the journey is to find answers to each of them. And so this is the challenge is finding providing visibility to the computing environment, identifying all the vulnerabilities that the IT infrastructure is exposed to, and having an integrated capability to remediate the problem and making it into a continuous and automated routine. So that's basically what we're going after. And this is sort of a framework that we have come up with that we today have a solution for. So when you look at the entire vulnerability management lifecycle, you have one requirement, which is to get visibility into the IT environment. Then you need to identify all kinds of weaknesses and loopholes that the infrastructure is exposed to. And then perform an assessment to understand what these vulnerabilities are and prioritize those vulnerabilities that you must act upon on sort of a priority scale, and then remediate those vulnerabilities within the same console and report it and make it into an automated process. So this entire framework, what we have is within one single solution. We call it as a cyber hygiene platform. It brings together multiple use cases that we talked about into one single console, provides visibility into the entire IT infrastructure, and identifies different kinds of vulnerabilities, from software vulnerabilities to misconfigurations to asset exposures, and also checks whether security controls that we have deployed are they functioning well or not, and then helps you with an assessment and prioritization of those vulnerabilities. So prioritization is something that is important when you're talking about billions of vulnerabilities that the IT infrastructure is subjected to. So you need to see which of those are highly critical, which of those are being exploited in the wild, which of those are publicly exploitable. So all kinds of intelligence data must be fed into the system in order to prioritize those vulnerabilities, so I can remediate those vulnerabilities on a raw footing. And then the others are also not something that we should ignore. There is a tendency to only act upon those high critical vulnerability because I cannot remediate all the problems, but the end goal should be to remediate all possible problems that an IT infrastructure is exposed to. The reason I say this is because attackers just need one entry point to get into the system. They're not looking at high priority vulnerabilities alone. It can be a simple misconfiguration, or it can be a simple asset that is unnecessarily exposed to the internet. So people can just come in and make their journey into the highly critical assets that are very important for the organization. So while prioritization is important, we need to apply those remediations on a raw footing, but others are also must be paid attention to. So this entire process, we're kind of making it into a continuous and automated routine to a larger extent.
Hey, if I can interrupt you just for a quick second. So two things come to mind for me big questions on my mind. So maybe some of our listeners will have these questions too. One, when it comes to gaining visibility into IT infrastructure, the first thing that comes to mind for me is, we talked about it earlier, which is, well, my IT infrastructure might be significantly different than another company's and another one and another one. Like how comprehensive a visibility are you going after? So this is why I asked earlier about can you do today versus what's the vision. Is it realistic to be able to say, yep, you're going to get 100% visibility into 100% of my IT infrastructure with this type of a model? Or is this a journey and you're going to provide visibility into 90% of my assets or 80% of my assets on day one, and this is a journey over time? So that's my first question. And the second which you can just follow on with here, which is sort of the human element, which is, as a security professional, makes me a little nudgy to think that you might take over all of this work from me. Not that I don't want you to, but I feel like I might experience a loss of control if you automate everything. And this is a, sort of a thematic pushback that we see in the entire security industry. Is like, I want automation, but I still want to have eyes, or when I want to be involved,
Mhm. Yeah, I think those are two very important questions. So it certainly is a journey. As we talked about early on, the IT landscape is also kind of widening. So you have different kinds of devices, different kind of environment, from OT, IoT, cloud infrastructure, enterprise computing, mobile devices, and all of them joining this IT landscape. So we have taken this journey. Today we have the coverage for the enterprise IT infrastructure. We're working on the cloud infrastructure and OT and IoT visibility as well. So it is a journey. It is not something that you will get today, complete visibility into the entire IT landscape that an organization has. And that is our dream, and that is our vision as far as the platform capabilities are concerned. So you need to have that visibility to the entire landscape. You need to be able to identify the misconfigurations and vulnerabilities of all kinds that these IT infrastructure is exposed to. So we have taken that journey. We've gotten some distance, and we're going to cover the whole breadth. So that's as far as the vision of the product is concerned. Today, we do have a complete solution for the enterprise computing environment, and we're extending as we speak. Now, the follow-up question is really an important question that you raised. Can everything be automated? And if those are automated, I kind of lose control, or sense of control is kind of lost there, because the human element is not there, and I don't know whether those controls are really working or not. So when you think about computing the journey, autonomous computing is something that is being talked about. It is not something that is a reality as yet. We are not trusting the machines to do everything by themselves. It is still uh, some distance away for us to get there truly. So even if you have automated at this point in time, it is essential to have that touch points where we could go ahead and see whether those controls are functioning properly, and I get visibility to see whether whatever I've done is actually being done or not. People are talking about automation, autonomous computing, all of those. I think at this point in time, we still need to have those touch points to really see that those functions are working as much as I would like it. So when we're talking about automation and making it into a continuous process, the journey is that it has to be automated. It has to do its job by itself to a larger extent. But at the same time, do we have visibility to see whether those are functioning properly? So we need to provide that visibility at this point in time.
Thanks for that.
Right? So we call it as an advanced vulnerability management framework. I highlighted three problems early on in the prior slide, where I talked about are we covering all the vulnerabilities? Do we have an integrated remediation or not? And is it a continuous and automated process? So with our framework, with our platform, Cyber Hygiene Sera, now Cyber Hygiene platform. So these are the promises that our platform delivers. One is certainty in knowing that I have understood and uncovered all the vulnerabilities that the IT infrastructure is exposed to. Sense of control, because we have that integrated remediation where you can go ahead and apply those remediation and make sure that those weaknesses are actually eliminated. In a disjointed or disconnected system, this is difficult to measure. someone else has applied the remediation and they say that I have actually applied, but my vulnerability management software is still saying that those are still there in the environment. So there's no proof to say that this is actually remediated. So it's having that sense of control that I have actually applied remediation, and because of that, that vulnerability is actually eliminated. The third is to make it into a continuous and automated process. So when you look at the vulnerability management lifecycle, if all of those are available within a single console and each of those stages talk to feed into one another, and machines sort of understand each other and apply those actions that are necessary at every stage, this continuous and making it into a continuous and automated process is possible. So these are the three value proposition sort of we offer through Sena Now Cyber Hygiene platform. So this is our platform architecture sort of with 6 different tools coming together on a single console with vulnerability management, configuration and compliance management, patch management, which is an integrated remediation for fixing the software vulnerability. Then we have an asset visibility and exposure tool that gives continuous visibility into the IT assets, but also identifies number of exposures which the environment is inherently having. And then with endpoint management, we are able to remediate other types of vulnerabilities that go beyond application of software patches. And then we also have an EQR module that will help one build their own query, discover the aberrations and deviations, and also have the response rules built into it so that you can actually act upon those problems. So this platform is working on all sorts of operating systems that we come across and different kinds of devices, whether it's virtual environment or desktops and the laptops and the workstations and server infrastructure, etc. So all of these is kind of unified into one single console, SaaS based deployment that we are having as part of this solution.
Chandra, can people get started with the solution in a monitoring capacity without ripping out everything I already have in place on day one?
Yes, so we kind of made it into a modular sort of an approach. So each of these modules that you see on the screen, whether it's vulnerability management, asset exposure, and patch management, etc., each of these can be provisioned by our customers and users depending on where they are at. Are they using other tools in their environment already? They're not looking to day zero implement an automated procedure. So all of those are possibilities. So if someone is looking at vulnerability management and patch management, they can just enable those tools, and as they go along their journey, they will be able to look at eliminating those existing investments and unify this entire vulnerability management journey with one single platform. So that's kind of the approach that we are taking. So if people come to us, can we make our environment NIST 853 or 171 compliant, and we have a CM module for that. So there are specific use cases that our customers use our product for, depending on where they are in their journey, and also what kind of tools are already in their environment, which they don't want to remove those because of investments that have already been made. So it's possible to do that.
Super. All right. How can people learn more?
Yeah. Please go to our website and secpod.com, and there is also senanow.com where people can onboard themselves into a trial activity. It's pretty easy to install it on a few systems and get the feeling within a matter of few minutes. Whatever we talked about is kind of presented on the console. Within that 10 minutes, we will be able to discover that and get that sense of truly advanced vulnerability management platform.
Super. Hey, we got a couple of minutes left for a handful of questions. Can I read a couple of the questions for you, and hopefully you continue?
Yeah, please go ahead.
First question is, this would seemingly show open network ports, outdated network device firmware, outdated installed software packages, all as part of the process. Is that correct?
Yes. So as part of the asset exposure, it's not just visibility into the IT environment, but we also identify open ports, processes, and services that are probably or rather unnecessarily installed and running, outdated software, end of life software. So all of those are identified as part of the asset exposure too.
Great, thank you. And then the next question was, what are the device models which are used in this environment? And I'm not exactly sure what's being asked there, but maybe you do.
I'm also kind of assuming that different kinds of devices is probably what is being asked. So whether it's the systems that are running on Windows and 7 distributions or Linux and Mac OS, etc. So we have a solution for all of that, including the network infrastructure or any IP-enabled device. We would identify, provide visibility into that, perform an assessment to identify the risk exposures, and also have an integrated remediation capability. So everything that is imaginable in an enterprise IT environment, we do cover all of those.
Great. Those were the two questions we had. Chandra, thank you so much for sharing the innovation that you guys are hard at work on. Hopefully our viewers learned a bit of a perspective about attack surface management and what's possible when it comes to expanding the definition of that management process in a more automated fashion. Thank you everyone for joining us along the way. If you do have any final questions, you can email them to the email address you see on the screen here, info@secpod.com. And our friends at SecPod will graciously share answers to your questions. So Chandra, thank you so very, very much. Have a lovely rest of your evening. Thank you, everybody. Morning, afternoon, and late in the day for those of you who joined us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dave. Wonderful talking to you all. Bye.
Bye, everyone.